Thank you, Jerry. I did not grow this beard to look more like that guy, but I guess I could work on it for a while. All right, let's start by reviewing the problems before I get to swoop in and offer some solutions. It's a rare situation to be able to offer solutions. Usually I just critique what other people do. But here I get to offer some solutions. But quickly, let's review what's going on and why we need solutions in the first place. This is about outcomes. It's about results and making sure that we're getting something for all of the activity that's going on in Congress and in the agencies that act upon what Congress told them to do. The big problem is we don't know if we're getting results. We do know there's a lot of output going on. Output is not the same as outcomes. Here is an example of output. This week, as you know, is the 5th anniversary of Dodd-Frank. So I put together this chart and put this up on our website earlier this week, which is showing you some of the outputs associated with Dodd-Frank. We've got two lines here. The green line is the number of restrictions that have been created by regulatory agencies since the passage of Dodd-Frank 5 years ago. So these are words like shall and must and may not that are in the Code of Federal Regulations that are citing as their statutory authority Dodd-Frank. We're adding them up over time so you get this cumulative line showing the total number of restrictions in the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations from Dodd-Frank. That's the green line. The blue line is all other laws passed since 2009, signed by President Obama since he took office. That's 237 other laws. Add them up together. Add all the regulations that have been created, all the restrictions in those regulations, add them together, and that's what the blue line is showing you. Dodd-Frank has created more restrictions in its 5 years than all other laws signed by the president since he took office. That's a monumental amount of output, if output is measured by how many words you can add to the Code of Federal Regulations or how many regulations have been made by agencies. But then again, what are we getting for that output? Dodd-Frank is a prime example of a congressional action where what appears to have occurred is Congress threw a bunch of stuff at the wall and didn't actually even wait around to see if anything would stick. It just threw a bunch of stuff at the wall and moved along. Because, as Jerry has pointed out, the analysis that goes on after the act of Congress is signed into law, after the regulatory agencies maybe do some analysis along the way, maybe not. At the end of the day, the retrospective review, looking at the results of regulations and whether they achieved what Congress intended them to achieve, doesn't ever occur, or rarely occurs. So they didn't stick around to see if anything stuck. That's the problem. We don't know what we're getting. Importantly, we do know we're getting costs, right? You all raised your hand, or mostly raised your hand, when Robin asked the question, do you think regulations are having an effect on the economy? For certain, 100% certain, every single regulation is associated with costs of the economy. It's not 100% certain that every regulation is associated with benefits to the economy. We want to make sure we're getting the benefits, but we know for sure we're getting costs. We want to try to propose now a solution that will let you get a handle on both of those and understand before you make a law and after a law has been turned into regulations, what you're getting out of them and if it's all worth it. Now this, if I may say so myself, is a miraculous slide compared to the flow charts that were shown earlier. I have managed to put into one single box here in the middle that big flow chart that Jason showed you about budget making. And then only in two boxes here, the flow chart that Jerry showed you about the regulatory process. This is what the regulatory process looks like now. If you consider the life of a regulation from when it was an idea in a congressional staffer's mind or in a congressman's mind, all the way to the point where it becomes a regulation. Right now what goes on, you get a bill, maybe you get some analysis of the bill, maybe not. Then it gets voted on, it becomes statute, and then the budget process occurs. Some agency budgets are decided upon, outlays are authorized, and then we go on to the analysis stage in some cases not, and finally you get the rules that are made. Linear, right? That's the end point. It doesn't include any sort of feedback loop that lets the members of Congress who signed that law understand whether the law is achieving what it's supposed to achieve. It doesn't even let agencies understand whether their regulations are achieving what they're supposed to achieve. All right, there's a couple of proposals, a couple of modifications to this process that we think could improve it greatly. I'm going to break this up into a couple of different pieces here. The first breakup is going to show you how we can add analysis at the very earliest stages, the stages when the bill is being considered prior to it becoming an act of Congress. So we'll zoom in here. When a bill is written, there's a very simple proposal here. We think that you could add in one simple stage prior to the voting. We're calling it legislative impact assessment. This is nothing more than having the act that's being considered, the bill that's being considered, be associated with the specific outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Tie in the act to the goals that are supposed to be achieved by the regulations that will later on be made. What this lets you do is, number one, quite obviously, understand whether regulations are achieving what the act was supposed to do. But then number two, it gives you an idea, if this assessment is done well, an idea of at what cost. You have this set of benefits that you're trying to achieve with the act, a set of changes to the world you're trying to achieve. But this assessment can also say, okay, let's just get a ballpark estimate of what costs will also be associated there. Once you know that, you can have a much better idea, A, of what you're getting, but B, of what you're exchanging for it, and is it worth it? So that's the first modification. The second modification involves changing that linear process from just a line to something that has a feedback loop. So here's what we saw earlier. Let's push that off to the side and consider the life of a regulation after a statute has been, after a bill becomes law, becomes a statute. As you saw earlier, that goes through a linear process, agency budgets are made, etc. We want to change that. So consider instead a feedback loop that starts again with agency budgets. So here in this diagram, we have the statutes feeding just to the agency budgets, just as before. Agency budgets are set. However, agency budgets are now set with some consideration of the legislative impact assessment that occurred earlier prior to the statute being signed, right? So think of it this way. That act is associated with a best estimate of what the act should cost. Now the budgets can be set knowing what Congress intended to spend at the agency level with that act. I don't just mean outlays. I mean economic costs. I mean the sort of costs that Jerry described when he was running down that iceberg, most of which was hidden underneath the water. So an association of economic costs with the act would occur at the agency budgeting stage. Second, we go through this, going up around the circle here, prospective analysis. As Jerry has wonderfully explained, a lot could be improved there. Now, this isn't necessarily something that has to go hand in hand with adding legislative impact assessment. It could not, but it's another reform that could help improve our understanding of what we're getting out of both the legislation and then the regulations that the legislation spawns. So whether this is achieved, improving prospective analysis before regulation is made, is achieved by, say, adding independent agencies to the list of agencies that are required to do analysis, or adding some sort of some mechanism to improve the quality of those analyses. I'm not going to offer the specific details, but there's certainly plenty of options to improve this stage of the process. Next, we get regulation, just as before, and then this stage down here says retrospective analysis. This would be entirely new. This is important. Jerry pointed out, we often don't see this, even though every president since Jimmy Carter has said we want to know what we're getting for our regulations, we want to get rid of duplicative or obsolete regulations. We really don't have an idea of how many are obsolete, how many are duplicative, how many just aren't working. They've tried and they've tried, but I'm convinced that the only way a good retrospective analysis process, retrospective review of regulations would occur is through congressional action. So if that were to occur, that would feed into this feedback loop. You'd know what are you getting out of the regulations you've made, and you would also know whether those regulations, what act of Congress those regulations are associated with, so then you can think about whether the legislation itself is achieving its goal or not, which comes up to the next stage, which is updating the legislative impact assessment. Remember, that was done at the very beginning of all this, an estimate of the costs that would be associated with an act of Congress, as well as an articulation of the outcomes the act is trying to achieve. That's important, right? Are you getting the results for that act of Congress? If you aren't, you want to take action on it, right? Congress does not want to have laws that don't actually result in what they intended them to achieve. Right now, there's not a very good process for Congress to go about modifying laws or stopping the endless forking over of outlays to agencies that aren't achieving what those laws intended to achieve. This would fix that, right? We now are saying we see what regulations are achieving or not achieving, and we can adjust accordingly, which goes back to the agency budgets. This is a built-in mechanism. It's already there that would allow Congress, if it had more information about what was being achieved with regulations, to then direct the agencies more appropriately by putting more money in some places, less money in other places, but there's going to be an understanding of whether the spending at different agency levels associated with the acts of Congress that the agencies are executing is actually working. And it can be adjusted most easily at that stage, as opposed to what are the options right now. You could have a complete new bill that you'd say try to pass that would modify the other legislation that you think may or may not be achieving what works. This is much less arduous. Once you have the information created, action is much more feasible at the budget level. So put it all together. Remember I slid some stuff off to the side. This is now the whole picture from the bill to the end of the life of a regulation. There really is no end, right? There's this feedback loop. You understand whether it's working or not. This process would go on as long as the regulation is having an effect on the economy, as long as that act is having an effect on the economy. Maybe every 5 years you want to look back, or I don't know what the period of time is, 10 years. Some period of time you want to look back and see if the regulations are working, and if they're not, it's time to modify the way that you're doing business. So in conclusion, go back over this. There's a bunch of different reforms that we've suggested here. One is the analysis of legislation, considering prior to making a bill into law what you're trying to achieve. What are the specific outcomes that are going to be associated with it so you can look back later on and understand whether it's working. A second one is improving the quality and the scope of prospective analysis, the analysis that goes on before a regulation is made. Another one, and a very important one, is adding some sort of retrospective analysis stage, looking at regulations and seeing if they're working and seeing what they're costing after the fact, not just before the fact. And then finally, using all this information to update budgets. The budget setting that you do, right, that Jason described at length, can be informed by the cost numbers that come out of these analyses. You could set some sort of economic cost budget in the same way that you currently authorize outlays. And then that economic cost budget can be updated with these prospective and retrospective analyses, which then allows action at the budgeting level. So in concluding remarks, I just want to hammer in the point. I think everyone in this room, I'm sure all members of Congress would agree, there's an obligation to know whether legislation is working or not. But unfortunately, we have a process now that doesn't easily lend itself to either knowing whether it's working, and even if you do know, acting upon that. The analysis of legislation, the proposed first modification, would give us a better idea of how to determine whether legislation is working. And then the better prospective analyses and retrospective analyses will give us a more concrete idea of whether they're working or not, whether the regulations caused by the acts are working. And then finally, budgetary adjustments is the easiest solution we can think of right now to put the power back in the hands of Congress, put them on an equal footing with the regulatory agencies. And I think we have time for questions. We'd all be happy to answer any of them.